Welcome to the 2022 Sleepless Readings Halloween Special. To celebrate Halloween this year, we're going to be doing something a little different than our usual horror fiction. Courtesy of our friend Jason over at historicalcrimedetective.com, we're going to take a look at 3 true but perhaps forgotten tales of horror from our very own world. Given that we're discussing real cases here, out of respect for the victims and their families, I won't be putting on any voices tonight, just reading them to you verbatim. I should note up front that since we're delving out of the world of horror fiction and into the world of horror fact, you may find these tales upsetting and disturbing. Fair warning. So, without further ado, let's dive into these true tales of horror from history by discussing a case from 1941 regarding Theodore Coneys, the Spiderman of Denver. Theodore Coneys was born November 10, 1882, in Petersburg, Illinois, to T.H. Coneys, a Canadian immigrant who owned a hardware store in Petersburg, and his wife. After the elder Coneys died in 1888, Mrs. Coneys and her son moved to a farm near Beloit, Wisconsin, then to Denver, Colorado in 1907, where she worked as a housekeeper at the Denver Democratic Club. She died in 1911. Coneys suffered from poor health and had been told by doctors not to expect to see his 18th birthday, so he did not finish high school. As an adult, he worked as a bookkeeper at the Denver Brass Works and in advertising and sales, yet spent much of his adult life homeless. Coneys resented the way he was treated by others for his frail condition, later expressing that he wanted a place where he could be alone and free from the judgment of others. In September 1941, 59-year-old Theodore Coneys intended to ask former acquaintance Philip Peters for a handout at his home on 3335 West Moncrief Place in Denver, Colorado. Coneys broke into the house in Peters' absence to steal food and money. In the ceiling of a closet, Coneys found a small trapdoor that led to a narrow attic cubbyhole and decided to occupy the small space without Peter's knowledge. Coneys lived in the house undiscovered for about 5 weeks. On October 17th, 1941, Peters discovered Coneys standing at the refrigerator looking for something to eat. Peters struck at Coney with a cane he carried, but Coneys clubbed him with an old pistol he had found in the house. After the gun broke apart, Coneys continued the assault with a heavy iron stove shaker and bludgeoned the 73-year-old Peters to death. Coneys then returned to the attic cubbyhole. Peters' body was discovered later the same day after a neighbor, concerned Peters had not come by for dinner, called the police. The police found all of the home's doors and windows locked, and there was no other sign of forced entry. They noted the trapdoor, but believed a normal-sized person could not fit through it. Peter's wife, who had been in the hospital recuperating from a broken hip during and prior to Coneys' occupation of the attic, returned to live in the house with a housekeeper. Both women would often hear strange sounds in the house. The housekeeper resigned after becoming convinced the house was haunted, and Mrs. Peters moved to western Colorado to live with her son. Coneys remained in the vacant house, with the occasional signs of his occupation written off as an apparition or local pranksters. Police continued to make routine checks when, on July 30th, 1942, one of them heard a lock click on the second floor. Running upstairs, the police caught the sight of Coneys' legs as he was going through the trapdoor and pulled him down. He was taken into police custody and confessed to the crime. Local newspapers dubbed him the Denver Spiderman of Moncrief Place, after police detective Fred Zarno remarked, A man would have to be a spider to stand it long up there. Coneys was tried and convicted, then sentenced to life imprisonment at the Colorado State Penitentiary in Cannon City, Colorado. Theodore Coneys died on May 16, 1967, at the Colorado State Penitentiary Prison Hospital. He was interred at Mountain Vale Cemetery in Cannon City. Now this one unsettled me some. I think we could all agree the idea of someone living in your walls without your knowledge is a terrifying thought, especially if they're capable of murder. Speaking of murder, let's take a look at a case from 1943 regarding one Sergeant Frank Martz, vampire slayer. On December 6, 1943, 27-year-old Ann Geist took her 3-year-old daughter, Kathleen Ann, to a tavern near Fort Logan, Colorado, where she met up with friends. At the time, Fort Logan was a small Army Air Force installation west of Englewood and 8 miles southwest of Denver. Soon after she arrived, Geist and her friends became preoccupied with playing a pinball machine, new at that time, and she forgot about her daughter. Also inside the tavern was Staff Sergeant Frank Martz, 33, a cook in the Army who had recently returned from South Dakota, where he visited his wife on furlough. When Martz realized the mother had forgotten about her daughter, he went to Kathleen and promised her soft drinks and, quote, a fluffy stuffed toy rabbit if she would come with him to his apartment. The girl agreed, and she and Martz left the tavern unnoticed. As they were walking home, they happened to pass by a patrolman, George Fritzinger, who thought they were father and daughter. According to a statement later given to reporters, once he had her inside his apartment, Martz struck Kathleen on her head with a blunt instrument. Sometime thereafter, he took a stout cord, wrapped it around the little girl's neck, choking her. He thereafter ravished and raped the little girl, evidenced by many teeth marks and wounds on the body. By the time she was dead, Ann Geist reported her daughter's disappearance to Patrolman Fritzinger, who remembered seeing Martz and the girl walking on the street earlier. Fritzinger then got 2 military policemen to go with him to Martz's apartment, where he answered the door, drunk and partially clothed. He was taken to the Englewood jail and questioned by detectives. Fritzinger and the military policeman then returned to Martz's apartment to search for Kathleen and found her torn body under the sink, the Associated Press reported. Martz, who had been a carnival and circus cook before joining the army, said he was drunk on beer and wine and didn't remember anything about the little dead girl in his apartment. 2 days later, he blamed the murder on vampire stories he had read earlier that day in pulp magazines. Martz told District Attorney Richard Simon in an oral statement that he had been confused by reading several detective stories Monday afternoon, including one which described how a vampire sucks the blood from a living body. Then he got so drunk, he said, that there were long intervals during which he could not remember what happened, the Associated Press reported. Coroner Ivan J. Foss said that the child's body was nude and bore numerous scratches and teeth marks. However, in his written statement, Martz did recall part of his attack. Since I have had time to think over events of Monday night, I cannot state positively that I remember taking the girl into my room and closing the door. I remember striking her, choking and beating her, and tearing off her clothes. In another part of the statement, Martz was quoted as saying, I was scared to death. I undressed, took all my clothes off, and I got into bed and pulled the covers over my head, and I was scared. Then the police came. His claim of being under the influence of alcohol and vampire stories did not help his case. During his February 1944 trial, He was convicted and sentenced to death by a Littleton jury. Because of World War II's dominance over other types of news coverage, there are only a handful of newspaper reports still available about this case. His case was appealed, but the Colorado High Court upheld his conviction and death sentence, which did not take place until November 23, 1945, at 8 p.m. To make sure the state was not executing a crazy man, possibly because he was under the influence of vampire stories at the time, a sanity hearing was held for Martz on the day of his execution. When Cannon City prison warden Roy Best appeared at his cell, Martz's face lit up with hope that his stay of execution was granted. But when Best started reading the death warrant, Martz's face quickly dropped. The would-be vampire then recovered and smiled at Father Justin McKernan, his spiritual advisor while on death row. Martz was then escorted out of his cell and led on the quarter-mile walk up to Woodpecker Hill, where the state's gas chamber was located. Martz, who was calm and steady in his march, received a helping but unwanted hand from one of the guards. "I don't need any help. I can walk by myself." He then told Father McKernan, "Pray for me. If anybody needs prayer, I do." During the last 2 weeks, Martz spent most of his time talking quietly with Father McKernan and reading a Bible given to him by death row inmate Charles Ford Stillman, who was executed 2 weeks earlier. Wearing nothing but his shorts and socks, Martz took his seat on a chair inside the gas chamber. As guards strapped Martz into the death chair, he held a crucifix in one hand, a St. Christopher medal in the other. The slayer raised the medal, symbolic of a safe journey, to his heart and said, "God forgive me, for I have sinned. I'm sorry." At 7:59, the sodium cyanide pellets were dropped into the sulfur acid, and Martz breathed deeply as he was instructed to do so. At 8:02, he was pronounced dead. After the chamber was flushed and purged, his corpse was cleaned with chlorine solution. Prison officials waited 20 hours for someone to claim the body. When no one did, he was buried in the prison cemetery on Woodpecker Hill. Personally, I found that case particularly horrifying. A true reminder that monsters do and have always existed among us. Let's finish things off with our third true tale from history. Jumping forward to 1974, let's take a look at the case of Ronald O'Brien, the Candyman. On Halloween night 1974, Ronald O'Brien took his 8-year-old son Timothy and his daughter trick-or-treating with some other neighborhood friends near their home in the Deer Park suburb of Houston. Since there was a light rain falling, they only collected candy in a 2-block area for half an hour before returning home. As he went to bed, Ronald agreed to let both of his children eat one piece of candy before they went to sleep. They both chose a large pixie sticks they had received. 30 seconds after I left Tim's room, I heard him cry to me, "Daddy, Daddy, my stomach hurts," Ronald later told reporters as he sobbed loudly. He was in the bathroom convulsing, vomiting, and gasping, and then suddenly he went limp. His son died 90 minutes later at the hospital, and by the next day, police had determined the pixie sticks was full of cyanide. His daughter, 5-year-old Elizabeth, who also chose the same candy before going to bed, still had it in her hand the next morning, unable to open it because of the staples that kept it shut. It, too, contained poison. News that a child had been poisoned to death exploded across Texas and the entire United States. One local detective working the case told an Associated Press reporter that parents should get rid of all the Halloween candy collected by their children. "It's just not worth the risk," the detective said. "If parents want their children to eat candy, let them go to the store and buy candy. Parents followed his advice and threw all of their children's candy away, and the event helped to forever spoil a once popular children's holiday. Ronald, an optician, aided police in their efforts to narrow down the location where the pixie sticks were handed out. During their search, 5 other poisoned pixie sticks were found with children who had also gone trick-or-treating with the O'Briens. Early in the investigation, Ronald's help raised their suspicions. He couldn't seem to locate the house, although it was in a small area. They also learned that he had recently taken out several life insurance policies on both of his children, and that his son was insured for $30,000, the 2015 equivalent of $145,000 when adjusted for inflation. On Monday, November 4th, Ronald O'Brien was arrested for the murder of his son. Police were tight-lipped over their evidence, but 1 week later, a recorded grand jury hearing revealed there was little doubt he was behind the murder. 2 months before his son's death, O'Brien telephoned a friend who was a chemist, asking about how he could get cyanide and how much would be fatal. When the chemist inquired why he was asking these questions, O'Brien replied that he was just curious and nothing more. Then, a chemical salesman testified that O'Brien tried to purchase potassium cyanide, but the only size they had available was their typical bulk size of 5 pounds. Since that was too much, O'Brien politely backed out of the sale. On the night of Halloween, friends who went with the O'Briens reported Ronald had gone to one particular house alone, and was seen returning with pixie sticks, which he gave to his own children, and their 2 children, and another neighborhood child. For those attempted poisonings, O'Brien was also charged with 4 counts of attempted murder. And finally, Ronald's own brother told the court that he, quote, was a poor manager who had trouble keeping a job and was in poor financial condition at the time of Timothy's death. During his trial, held in May 1975, these witnesses and his own wife testified against him. Daneen O'Brien told the jury that life with her husband bore a constant struggle with debt and financial pressure. Although they were behind on some loan payments, she revealed that her husband had bought $10,000 of accidental life insurance policies for both of their children. After Timothy's funeral, she learned he had spent another $108 on premiums for 2 more policies valued at $20,000 each. When her husband began talking about how they were going to spend the money after their son had just died, she became alarmed. He wanted to pay off bills and then take a trip to Florida, she said. The Associated Press captured her sentiment towards her husband during his trial. Mrs. O'Brien, testifying in a trial that could send her husband to the electric chair, appeared cool and without emotion. She spoke in a clear, steady voice and kept her eyes averted from her husband. Later, his insurance agent testified that Ronald called him within hours of Timothy's death to begin the process of filing the claim. During the defense's case, character witnesses were called who testified that Ronald O'Brien was, quote, a sweet guy who was always kind to children and attended church regularly where he donated his time. He was a very concerned parent, very sensitive to their needs, one of his co-workers told the court. His attorney also tried to counter some of the more damaging claims by prosecution witnesses, including his attempt to purchase cyanide and his discussions of cyanide with co-workers. Later, during closing arguments, he pointed out that the prosecution was unable to prove his client actually purchased cyanide from any chemical company. But it wasn't enough, and on June 3rd, 1975, the man who ruined Halloween was declared guilty after the Houston jury deliberated for just 46 minutes. The next day, the 31-year-old former auxiliary police officer, optician, and future ex-husband was sentenced to die in the electric chair. But by March 31st, 1984, the execution method had changed to lethal injection. 8 years, 9 months, and 28 days after he was sentenced to die, Ronald Clark O'Brien, the Houston Candyman, and the man who ruined Halloween, was pronounced dead at 12:48 in the morning. He maintained his innocence all the way to the end. In an interview before he died, the reinvigorated Christian said, quote, "Because I have no guilt, I've really got nothing to worry about." The miracle he was hoping for never came. In his final statement, he applied his faith to forgive those who were about to wrong him. "What is about to transpire in a few moments is wrong. However, we as human beings do make mistakes and errors. This execution is one of those wrongs, yet doesn't mean our whole system of justice is wrong. Therefore, I would forgive all who have taken part in any way in my death. Also, to anyone I have offended in any way during my 39 years, I pray and ask your forgiveness, just as I forgive anyone who offended me in any way. And I pray and ask God's forgiveness for all of us respectively as human beings. To my loved ones, I extend my undying love. To those close to me, know in your hearts I love you one and all. God bless you all, and may God's best blessings be always yours. Ronald C. O'Brien. P.S. During my time here, I have been treated well by all TDC personnel." Outside the Huntsville, Texas prison, employees from a local bar handed out pixie sticks to the 200 to 300 people who had gathered outside the death chamber. Truly unsettling stuff. To kill your own children for money is just unthinkable. Not to mention trying to kill other neighborhood children for seemingly no reason other than you had spare cyanide, I suppose. Well, in any case, that brings us to the end of these true tales of horror. Thanks again to Jason from historicalcrimedetective.com for letting us look at some of his work. I encourage you to go and check out his website. These were but 3 tales of many. I had to take some time off for various personal and technical reasons, but on this, the spookiest of holidays, I'm pleased to report that I'm back, and you can expect regularly scheduled content from now on. Thank you all for your patience in this downtime. It's good to be back. Happy Halloween. I'll see you all next week. And as always, stay sleepless.